Hey, can I ask
Um,
Larry? Larry, can I
huh?
ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Quick question for Larry. I wonder where you're sitting, Larry. It looks like a real media center behind you there.
I'm sitting in my little cubby hole at home.
Okay, well,
And that's like a bookcase behind me where I keep different books and a few albums and things like that. It's kind of junky, unfortunately.
that's your space, though.
It's my space. That's right.
Okay, good.
But it's not your closet. We
No.
usually get to see Vince's closet. So Larry, you want to go ahead and start?
Sure. Let's see if we can.
You can just give them a little bit of background about yourself and.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm one of the partners in a company called the Prime Group. And all we do is cost of service studies, rate design, depreciation studies for electric, gas, and occasionally a water or sewer utility. We work all over the country. We've worked in, the vast majority of the states in the United States. There's probably maybe 2 or 3 that we haven't worked in. I personally have been doing this a little over 30 years. I got my start at an investor-owned utility, Louisville Gas and Electric Company, in their rate and regulatory department back in 1987. And I've been doing cost of service studies and rate design ever since. So I've done, hundreds of these over the years. And so that's kind of my background. And we did this study for San Luis Valley. And what I'm going to try to do is kind of give you a high level overview of the process that we go through and take you through the results of the study and kind of discuss what they mean, that kind of thing. We're going to talk a little bit about rate design and how different rate designs impact fairness and equity, those kinds of things. So, and like Sharice said, please, stop me at any point, interrupt me at any point if you have a question, and we'll answer it there so that we keep the context of what we're talking about. And if you want to dig deeper into anything, please stop me as well, and we can dig as deep as you want to dig. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. Can everybody see the screen?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good. So just a generic overview of the process. When you change rates, you typically do a cost of service study to determine how each class is performing relative to their cost of providing service. Mm-hmm. And then once you do that, you do what's called a revenue requirement analysis, which is a calculation of how much revenue does the utility, in this case a cooperative, need. And then from that, you design rates. So if there's an increase, for example, you figure out how you're going to spread that increase across each class of service, and then you design rates off of that. So that's kind of the overall process that you go through.
Larry, this is Vince. Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Was it you or your corporation or business that did the original cost of service study that led to the rate change at SLV a year and a half ago.
Yes, we did the last cost of service study and designed the new rates.
I see, and it was your cost of study that offered to SLVREC at least 4 different options that led to the demand rate schedule.
Yes,
Thank you.
Okay, I have a quick question also, Larry. Quick question, and that is, this entire process is proprietary information? And why is that so?
it's proprietary in the sense that, and I'm speaking in terms of how usually my clients view it. But the information is something, if utilities had it, that they butt up against their service territory. In other words, you're competing against. If those utilities had this detailed of information, then they could use it to create a competitive advantage in those areas where they butt up against each other. So they typically try not to publicly release this type of information.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
I think this is Laurie. When Vince, I think it was Vince who asked that your company is the one that came up with the last rate. Are we talking about the rate where our monthly was based on the highest 15 minutes? Is that the rate we're talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
we presented demand rates. Those are called demand rates, 3-part demand rates. Although some of them are 4-part demand rates, but we presented those as options for every single class.
And Larry, just to throw in there too, Kate was asking why the study was done.
Yes, the study is typically done, and I can't speak for, why the board decided to do a study at the time that they did it, because I'm not privy to that information. But typically you do a cost of service study to try to determine where your subsidies are, how each class of service is performing relative to the costs that they incur on the system. And also you would do them if you anticipate a need for additional revenue, which wasn't the case here. In other words, these were revenue neutral rates overall, but there's lots of reasons that you do cost of service studies.
Okay.
Okay, may I ask another question? This is Laurie again.
Sure.
So you said this was a revenue neutral situation. And
Yes.
I did earlier you say you didn't know why the SLVREC wanted the study? They didn't give you
No,
a
what I'm
reason?
saying is,
Or are we not allowed to know?
no, when people hire me,
Mm-hmm.
they don't say we're doing a study for this reason. They just contact me and ask me to do a study. But typically what they're interested in is they want to know how each rate schedule is performing relative to its cost of providing service.
So
And they wanna
typically,
know-
if I can jump in, Larry, and I just
Yeah.
want to explain that typically, because I do think we answered this in some of the questions, but typically utilities will do a cost of service study every 3 to 5 years.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a typical process that any utility does. So my guess is in this particular case, I believe we had asked about this. It was that time for them to do it.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so, and I don't know how long it had been since they had done one. So I guess my answer to the question is, I'm usually not, told exactly why they're doing studies, but that, they want to do a study.
So
Okay,
we can move forward with this if you would like.
Great.
okay, so this study was based on the 12 months into December 2017. In other words, that's the accounting data, sales data that went into the study. And when you do a study, you always adjust what's called the test year for pro forma adjustments, because what you're trying to design rates off of is a year that's going to be representative on a going forward basis. So you want to make adjustments, for example, if there's going to be labor cost increases because people are getting raises, you would want to adjust for those kinds of things so that what you're basing your rates off of is a representative year on a going forward basis. And this is a standard approach in the industry. In other words, you typically pick a 12-month period and you make adjustments to that 12-month period to make it representative on a going forward basis.
Okay.
So let's talk about, and some of you may understand these concepts, but just so we're all kind of on the same page, I usually like to talk a little bit about key terms and concepts that I'm going to be using as we talk about rates and cost of service. So the first one is really the concept of energy versus demand. So when you look at the term kilowatt hours, I'm sure we've all heard the term kilowatt hours. That's a term that describes the amount of energy we're using, whereas kW or kVH sometimes is a term that describes the demand we impose on the system, okay? So the difference between the two is kW or kilowatts is a measure of the load over a given period of time, such as 15 minutes. And what it does is it's a measure of the capacity requirements that have to be installed to meet the load. In other words, when a utility puts in a transformer or sizes the conductor, those kinds of things, it has to be able to carry enough load to meet your highest demand at a given point in time. So that determines the size of the facilities that go into place. And that's
Well, but-
demand related.
But the kilowatt is just a simply flow of energy over a specific time interval. It doesn't
You're
really
talking about
necessarily.
kilowatt hours or kilowatts?
Kilowatts, it's a flow. It's not necessarily a load. It could be, it's just a flow of energy, right?
Over a measured time interval, right?
Well, then it would be, yeah, but it's really, a kilowatt hour would be that flow of energy to our house over an hour.
Right. Right. In other words, if you measure it over an hour's time period, they're the same number.
I understand that. It's really not just necessarily a load, though. I mean, the load makes it sort of the utilities perspective on. It's really a flow of energy.
It's semantics. I mean, the point being is that when a utility plans its distribution system, when it installs transformers, conductor, substations, those kinds of things, it plans it to meet a peak short interval. In other words, an hour doesn't matter. It's
May I say
7
something?
minutes or 15 minutes. It's got to be sized to meet a very short spike interval of demand.
Larry, Vince has a question or wants to say something.
May I comment about the kilowatt? Kilowatt very simply is the magnitude of electricity being used at any particular instant.
That's a good way of
Of
putting
course,
it.
the kilowatt hour is magnitude over an hour long. So,
Right, that's a good way of putting it.
yeah, kilowatt is like when I turn on my dryer, it is using 4 kilowatts. Now, I will, if I run it for 4 hours, then I'm going to pay for 4 kilowatt hours.
That's a good way of putting it. KW is the magnitude, whereas kilowatt hours is the measure over an hour of what something uses. It's a good way of putting it. And the facilities that a utility installs is based on the magnitude, not the kilowatt hours.
That's it. I understand that. That's right.
Okay. So let's talk about load factor and coincidence factor. Because in a cost of service study, these have very significant effects on ultimately the cost of providing service. So load factor is the measure of how much of a member's maximum demand it uses over time. So it's the average demand divided by the maximum demand. So in other words, if you used 100 kW as your maximum demand, but your average over the month was 50 kW, you have a 50% load factor, which means you're only using 50% of your maximum demand on average. Coincidence factor is how much of your maximum demand is actually hitting the purchase power demand, so, or tri-state's demand that San Luis Valley gets billed from tri-state. So if 100% of your maximum hits tri-state's billing hour, then you're 100% coincident. If only half of your maximum demand hits that billing hour, you're 50% coincident, okay? So how that translates into rates, if you look at load factor, for example, and what I've done is given you 3 customers, A, B, and C. They each have the same maximum demand of 100, but they have different load factors. So customer A has a 10% load factor, customer B has a 50% load factor, customer C has a 100% load factor. And you can see that reflected in the energy that they consume. Okay, the demand cost is the same. In other words, the capacity, the facilities that the utility had to install to be able to deliver that 100 kW is the same in each case. So the demand cost at $10 a kW is the same for each customer. It's $1,000. The energy cost varies because of the different kilowatt hours that they use at 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So their total cost is the sum of those two numbers. If you take the total cost and divide it by the kilowatt hours, you see the significant difference in the cost of providing service that load factor has on each delivered cost. So to start out with, low load factor customers are going to be more expensive to serve in general than higher load factor customers, because higher load factor customers are utilizing that demand at a higher rate. In other words, the facilities that's been installed to meet that customer's maximum load, that customer is utilizing those facilities at a high rate. So they get to spread that cost over more kilowatt hours. Low load factor customers use those facilities at a very low rate. So they spread that cost over fewer kilowatt hours, which makes it a higher cost per kilowatt hour. That concept in general makes sense to everybody.
Yeah.
I have a question about that, and that is
Sure.
that actually in a residential area, the demand of individual customers may not be very, very high,
Mhm.
and it actually may balance out over a small service area so that the demand is actually not so great.
What do you
I mean-
mean by balance out?
Well, I mean, someone's using a lot of power at 6 o'clock and someone's using a lot of power at 8 o'clock. Someone's using power at 10 o'clock. So really, in terms of the actual demand, the flows and the capacity of the lines, it sort of it would seem to me that for a neighborhood where you have a bunch of customers that are using relatively small amounts of power, that it would balance out so that there wouldn't be any great spikes in use in a small customer base.
Typically, that's not going to be true. In other words, if you look at load data, meaning 15-minute interval data, for example, for residential customers, and let's just talk about winter, for example.
Yeah.
Typically, what you will see is from 6 to 8, 6 to 9 in the morning, you have a huge spike in the demand because everybody gets up, gets ready for work, heads off to work. And you'll see typically in the wintertime, a morning peak, and then it drops way off. And then when people start coming home at the end of the day, say from 4 to 6, 4 to 7, you have a secondary peak that spikes back up and then it drops back off again later in the evening. In other words, residential consumption tends to follow very specific patterns. In the summertime, you see less of a morning peak because it's not hot yet. And what you see is a evening peak around the time that people come home from work. It typically in that 4 to 6, 4 to 7 range, you see a big major spike in residential demand, and then it falls back off again as it cools off later in the day.
So is that something you look at in a particular utility and a particular
yes,
customer?
we get load data where it's available, and San Luis Valley had load data. So all of this is based on actual residential, or it's not just residential, it's for each rate schedule, but all of this is based on actual residential demands, is what was used to determine the cost.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Any other questions about load factor? Okay, so let's talk about coincidence factor.
I just posted a question and was
Yeah,
muted.
go ahead.
So, for the load capacity, is the equipment rated per 15 minutes, or is it more of this equipment can handle X load simultaneously?
Well, you're getting into engineering questions, and I'll be the first to tell you I'm not an engineer, but I've been around and done a lot of talk with engineers who plan systems, but an engineer could probably answer your question better than I can about the ratings of the equipment. But distribution systems, generation capacity, for example, if you're tri-state and you're planning your generation capacity, those kinds of things are designed around being able to deliver power during peak conditions. In other words, that peak, whether it's 15 minutes, some of these demand rates go as low as like 5-minute intervals. It just depends on the utility.
May I comment?
Well, yeah, hang on just a second. But the facilities have to be able to deliver power during the system's peak demand requirements. You know, how those are rated, how a transformer is rated, I can't really answer that. But yeah, Vince, go ahead.
I'm not an engineer, but I know a little bit about electricity. I think the answer to that, it is somewhat instantaneous. In other words, the transformers, the lines have to be able to handle the capacity that is being drawn, the load,
Right.
at a particular instant. It's not a 15-minute interval. It's what that transformer is able to handle when there's the surge or peak that is going through the lines and transformer to the customers that are on the end of that line.
Right. So every load, for example, that's connected to the system, distribution engineers will try to make a determination as to what those peak load requirements are. And they will size the transformer and the line capacity to handle that load plus some margin of error.
So I would guess, Larry, that some of the biggest instantaneous demands in the valley are when a center pivot electric pump is turned on. So you have an instantaneous, really heavy demand starting that pump, and then maybe that's only 5 seconds or 3 seconds.
Right.
But that kind of a demand, that's what the system has to be able to handle. 15 minutes is irrelevant in a way.
When you're talking about motor load, especially,
Yeah,
that startup demand spikes, and then as the motor runs, it kind of levels off.
that's right. That's right. And it has a starter coil and probably a huge one for those pumps. And
Yeah.
so those are probably the biggest instantaneous demands in the entire distribution system of the co-op.
Yes, but fortunately, not every center pivot pump turns on at the same time. So now we're getting to what you were talking about early, David, is that kind of averages out. If every pump in the valley turned on the same second, it would blow the system.
Yeah. But still, in a local area, if you got one, you have to have the capacity to handle that spike.
Right.
That's a much greater spike than you'd have in any residential area in a local line. I mean, line going to the actual service.
And that is why the peak load in the summertime in particular, the peak load for SLVREC is somewhere in the nighttime, but somewhere around 10, 11 o'clock or in there, because it is at the nighttime that many of the agricultural center pivots are turned on for conservation of water and efficiency, that kind of thing. So by far the peak load for SLVREC is determined by the center pivots, as you were saying, David, than the homes. No matter, we don't even get near the peak load that the agricultural sector does at nighttime.
So just for the sake of time, we still have like some more slides to go through.
Okay, we got a good one. Yeah.
We'll get, because I want you guys to be able to see the actual study for San Luis Valley.
Okay.
So coincidence factor is simply a measure of, what percentage of a customer's maximum demand hits Tri-State's billing hour. So, just logically, the higher the percentage, the more purchase power demand costs San Luis Valley has to incur. So if you look at, once again, customer A, B, and C, 10% coincidence factor, 50% coincidence factor, and 100% coincidence factor, this bottom row shows you the impact on average cost per kilowatt hour. And so if you think about it logically, the most expensive customer to serve on a system is somebody who has a low load factor, but whose demand is highly coincident with the purchase power billing demand. Your less expensive customer on the system is somebody who has a higher load factor, but also manages to avoid the purchase power billing hour. And of course, you know, most folks fall somewhere in between those two extremes. So the cost of service study, we use what's called NARUC methodology, which is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. They publish a cost allocation manual that describes what they consider to be best practices in the industry for allocating costs in a cost of service study. So what we do is not Larry Feltner's methodology or the Prime Group's methodology. It's not proprietary in any way. The methodology we use is what NARUC suggests is the best practices in terms of cost allocation. And just to be clear, because I don't know if people have this misconception or not, but because of that fact, the client, or in this case, San Luis Valley, doesn't really have any influence over how the study turns out. In other words, they provide us with data. They answer questions that we ask, but we put in the data. We allocate the cost based on the prescribed methodology from the NARUC cost allocation manual, and the results are what the results are. In other words, there's no manipulation, there's no input from San Luis Valley about how can we raise or lower a particular class's rate of return. It is you know, I'm completely independent in terms of producing those results. Okay, cost of service study, what does it do for us? What does it tell us? First, it determines if the revenue generated by a class is covering the costs of providing service. That's the big thing that it tells us. It also tells us what subsidies there are between classes. It tells us what the cost-based rate components are in a rate. In other words, it tells us what the customer charge should be. It tells us what the kilowatt hour charge should be. It tells us what the KW charge should be. And it is a fairness and equity tool. In other words, it was created by regulatory bodies in the United States in order to determine whether rates that are being charged by utilities are fair and equitable. And that's really its purpose in the industry, is to determine fair and equitable rates. Okay, now the process we go through is really 3 steps. It's what's called functional assignment, classification, and allocation. And functional assignment, what we mean by that is it's literally organizing the accounting data that they provide by what we call functional categories. In other words, we're trying to sort those costs by what type of cost it is. And this is just a very generalized example: purchase power, distribution, other. In reality, we have things like primary distribution, secondary distribution, line transformer, metering, customer service, meter reading and billing. In other words, we have lots of functional categories, and functional assignment is simply organizing those costs by what type of cost they are. Classification is a further organization of those costs into, well, what's driving those costs on the system. Is it related to demand of some kind? Is it related to the number of kilowatt hours that's being sold? Or is it related to the number of customers on the system? For example, purchase power energy would be related to the amount of kilowatt hours that you're selling. That's what's driving that cost. Meter reading and billing would be related to how many bills you send out or how many customers are on the system. Transformers, for example, would be related to the capacity or the demand that you have to deliver at a given point in time. That would determine the transformer cost on your system because they're installed to meet that capacity. So classification further organizes the accounting data by what's driving it or what's causing us to incur those costs on the system. And then finally, allocation is where we take those organized costs and we allocate them to each customer class or each rate schedule based on how they're classified. So if it's meter reading and billing, for example, it's going to be allocated based on the number of bills that were sent out. If it's purchase power energy, it's going to be allocated based on the kilowatt hours that were consumed by each rate schedule. So there's a matching in how we allocate the cost and what's driving it on the system. Any questions about that process? That's a very high level explanation of the process, but that in a nutshell, that's what we go through.
What is other, Larry? What is other?
Other would be things like customer service, meter reading and billing, those kinds of things. In other words, not distribution costs, but things like that.
Okay.
And like I said, this isn't the functional categories used. This is just a very high level example.
Oh, may I comment? Other would also include the fee for you to do your service, wouldn't it? It would also include lawyer fees to take the CEO to court, which is over in the range of $200,000 to $300,000, and also this survey thing, this series of meetings that we are having, because that's a cost that is incurred.
Yes, that's correct.
That cost will get those three costs will get distributed through our bills.
Right. Right. Okay. So here is the actual results of the study. And as you can see, we do it by rate schedule. And this is very similar to an income statement, if you've seen income statements. So we start out with revenue, and then we have operating expenses, which is the culmination of the allocations that we do in the cost of service study. And from that, we get operating margin, which is revenue less operating expenses. And then rate base is the investment in facilities to serve the customers. In other words, that's lines, poles, transformers, all the facilities that are out there to serve. So that's the investment in the facilities that's required to serve the load. Return on rate base is like a return on investment calculation. It is the operating margin divided by rate base. So that calculates a rate of return. So very similar to a return on investment calculation. And how we look at subsidies, for example, in a perfect world, and keep in mind, I've done this a little over 30 years, and I've done hundreds of cost of service studies, and I've never seen this. Okay. So what I'm describing to you is an ideal that we're striving to hit, but in reality, you never see it. But in a perfect world, what perfect fairness and equity would look like would be that every class has a 5.66 rate of return. In other words, there wouldn't be any variability in the rate of return. That's all things being equal. Now, of course, if you've got a class or a customer that is highly risky, if you can extract a higher rate of return from that class or customer because of the riskiness, it would certainly be acceptable to try to extract a risk premium from that particular class because of their increased riskiness. But all things being equal, what fairness and equity looks like would be equalized rates of return. So how to interpret this in terms of subsidy is anybody, any class with a rate of return above the overall rate of return is paying a subsidy. Any class with a rate of return below the overall rate of return is receiving a subsidy. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions about this at all?
I have one.
Just to clarify then, just to reflect that, large power service is very profitable.
Is very profitable, right?
And large power TOD is even more profitable, but its overall total amount is relatively very little.
Right, right.
So it's not as important per se as large power service.
Right.
I mean,
Now let me point out one thing. A cost of service study, because it is a fairness and equity tool. In other words, we're trying to get to fair and equitable rates. It has all costs included in it. In other words, it has sunk costs, it has all costs included. So this is not as much about economics as it is about fairness and equity. In other words, in economics, we would look at marginal revenue and marginal cost. In cost of service, because we're interested in fairness and equity, we're looking at total revenue and total cost. So I just want to make that distinction to you, so there's no misunderstanding of what we're looking at here.
Lori had
May
a
I
question too.
comment?
Vince, hang on one second. Lori had a question.
I did. So this is for the SLVREC, or are these just numbers?
No,
For an example.
this is San Luis Valley, yes.
This is the one.
This is the cost.
So
this
I
is
actually
the
took a
result of
picture
the
and
study.
I took
Yeah.
a picture so I could blow it up on my phone and see it better.
Okay,
So for example, when I look at this, Schedule 1 TOD, irrigation TOD is getting a hefty subsidy compared to security lighting, right? Am I reading that right? Because you said if it's in a negative, it's getting a subsidy, right?
if it's below the overall, so below 5.66%.
Okay, so it's a whole bunch of them are below. All right, I understand that. Okay.
Yes,
Okay, and that's why that's what the other question about the large power is
Mhm.
is the golden egg. Okay,
yeah. Now the ones that are negative, in other words, Schedule A TOD,
right.
Schedule I TOD, and security lighting, the total revenue is not sufficient to cover the total operating expenses that we've allocated. So they actually have a negative margin. Okay. So those negative rates of return mean that the operating margin, the revenue is less than the operating expenses that were allocated to the class in the study.
So they're losing money.
They're losing money.
Right.
Now, from an economic perspective, they may not be. In other words, the marginal cost is pretty much purchase power for a distribution cooperative. So it very well could be that when you look at marginal revenue compared to purchase power costs, they're all actually making money. It's just that they're not making enough money to cover the fixed costs that we've also allocated to. So once again, this is a fairness and equity tool, not economic profit tool.
So then a goal like for the REC would be that the next time we have one of these studies, those numbers might be more better, more beneficial.
Right, what we
Like it
try
might-
to do.
Yeah.
Yes, what we try to do, and you'll see this in a slide below, because I'll show you the rates of return after the increase or the rate change. It's not really an increase. And what we try to do each time we have a rate change is to improve the dispersion of those rates of return so they're a little more uniform. In other words, we try to reduce the subsidies and make them a little more fair and equitable after the change than they were before the change.
Which of these schedules is residential?
Schedule A. Okay, so let's move on. So that rate of return, in other words, that 5.66, what does that really mean? That 5.66 has to be high enough to cover the utilities financing costs. Or in the long run, it's not economically viable. In other words, in the short run, you can borrow money and you can do some things, but in the long run, if you're not earning a high enough rate of return to cover your financing costs, then you're either going to default on your debt obligations or something like that. So ultimately, that 5.66 has to be sufficient to cover San Luis Valley's cost of financing. So this is not real numbers. This is just an example. So every utility's cost is made up of what they borrow in terms of debt and what they get with rural electric cooperatives. The equity piece comes from members. In other words, it's members' equity. If it were a publicly traded investor-owned utility, that would come from the purchase of common stock. Okay, so in this example, just to kind of illustrate what we're talking about, let's say the cost of debt or borrowing was 5%, and the cost of members' equity, which is hard to measure. There's formulas where you can estimate it, but it's not something you can readily measure. Typically, in finance, you think of it as the member's opportunity cost. In other words, what could you have earned on that money had you been able to keep it and invest it on your own, as opposed to investing it with the rural electric cooperative. So in this example, we're going to say the opportunity cost on members' equity is 7%. So if we assume the cooperative financed the system 50% debt, 50% members' equity, that means their weighted average cost of financing is 5% for debt times the 50% financed with debt, plus 7% for members' equity times the 50% financed with members' equity, gives us a weighted average cost of 6%. So if that was the real number, then the return on rate base would have to be 6%, or in the long run, the cooperative would begin to either default on the debt or not be able to pay capital credits to its members. In other words, it wouldn't be sufficient to operate. Now, in the real world, that is probably somewhere around 5 to 5.25%. So the 5.66 that they're earning is sufficient to cover their financing costs. In some cases, I've seen it as low as 4.5%. So if you look at the range with our clients of what we see with targeted overall rates of return, it's typically somewhere between 4.5% and 6.5%. If you're on the high side of that, in the 6.5% range, it's typically cooperatives that are trying to build equity. In other words, they have very low equity. They need a higher rate of return to try to build equity. So San Luis Valley, their rate of return was fine, so they didn't need additional revenue. So the rate changes we made overall were revenue neutral. In other words, they didn't get any additional revenue from the rate changes that we made. And this is something we've already talked about, you know, in terms of subsidies, classes with a rate of return below the overall are receiving a subsidy, classes with a rate of return above the overall are paying a subsidy. So we've kind of already covered that. And like I said, the national average is in the low 5s. So their rate of return was sufficient and they didn't require additional revenue. So what did we end up doing? Like I said, there was no overall increase in revenue. It was revenue neutral. But rates for each class were designed to reduce the subsidy from where it currently sat. So some classes increased, some classes decreased in order to have an impact on those subsidies. The amount of subsidy that we chose to reduce was really a balancing act based on the impact that those rate changes had on the class. In other words, if you had to increase a class 60% in order to get rid of 100% of the subsidy, we wouldn't have done that. We would have pared back to reduce something less than 100% of the subsidy so that the rate impact wouldn't have been so large. And there's a principle in rate making called gradualism, where you try to balance those two considerations and make sure that you don't create rate shock for a particular class by, you know, hitting them with a 50% increase or something like that. And rates were also designed to bring the individual charges in the rate. In other words, customer charge, kilowatt hour charge, demand charge, closer to cost. And by doing that, you also reduce subsidies within the rate schedule itself. And that's something you can't see really in a cost of service study because it doesn't show that. But to the extent that the charges in a given rate aren't cost-based, it creates subsidies inside the class. In other words, some individual members will have higher rates of return. Some members will have very low or negative rates of return inside the class because the charges themselves aren't cost-based. Any questions on that? Okay.
I have a question on this and a little to go back.
Okay.
For the fixed costs, how did you guys distribute them among the different classes? For example, a house that sits next to an irrigation well, would that
Okay.
would be equal? Would that, I'm just curious on the distribution of that, and then
Okay,
how does
so
that affect the subsidization later on?
so here's how that works. So let's start off by something we've already talked about a little bit, and that is we had real data for this study. Okay, so we didn't have to estimate anything because San Luis Valley had interval data for all of their members. Okay, so from the interval data, we know what the demands are that we use to allocate cost with. So let's start there. So in the study, there's 3 different demand allocators. In other words, you've got purchase power demand, which is based on the hour in which Tri-State bills their demand. So what we were able to do with the interval data is go to that hour each month that Tri-State bills off of and measure what each class was contributing to that purchase power demand that San Luis Valley was having to pay Tri-State. So we were able from the data to determine each class's contribution to the purchase power demand costs. So that's the first allocator. The second demand allocator is for primary distribution costs and substation distribution costs. And it's based on what's called the class's maximum demand. Okay. So for all of the primary distribution and substation costs, we went into the interval data and pulled each class's highest demand or highest interval, however you want to think about that. And that was the allocator for primary distribution and substation costs. For secondary distribution and line transformer costs, it's allocated on what's called sum of individual member maximum demands. And how to think about that is if we were all in the same class, it would be my highest demand plus Mark's highest demand plus Vince's highest demand plus Lori's highest demand, so on and so forth, summed together for the class. Okay, that is what's used to allocate secondary and line transformers. Now, the Nehrup logic behind that is when you're designing your distribution system and you design the sizing of your secondary distribution and line transformers, those are sized to meet a localized maximum demand. So we use a individual member maximum demand or a localized demand for the allocator. As you get further away from the customer with primary distribution and substation costs, those are designed to meet a diversified demand. So we use a diversified demand or a class maximum demand as the allocator for those. Now, non-distribution costs, when you get into things like meter reading and billing, customer service, those kinds of things, those are allocated based on the number of customers in the class. Okay, because they're not driven by kilowatt hours or demands. Those costs are incurred based on how many customers they have to service. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's how everything is allocated to each class of service. Make sense?
Mostly, is there any consideration to geography for this though? For,
No.
You know, okay.
No.
I'm looking at the screen.
In fact, most states have struck down geographic rates. In other words, in some places you will see like rural and urban rates. In most states, those have been struck down as discriminatory. Not in all states, but in some. So another problem too with geographic rates that come up is once you start splitting things by geography, you get into age of the assets as well. So do we give a certain geographic location that has highly depreciated assets a low rate compared to another geographic area that has newer assets that aren't as fully depreciated? And then once the older assets are completely replaced and they're brand new, do you raise the rates in that geographic area 30% or whatever it would be to account for the fact that we've replaced most of those depreciated assets, and now that's a higher cost area because we phased a lot of those assets out and replaced it with new. And, you know, in terms of regulation, commissions don't want that. In other words, they want to treat everyone the same. And they want to treat everyone as if the age of the assets and everything is the same, because it creates rate continuity. You don't get rates that are jumping all over the place because we're replacing assets here and we're not replacing them over here and that kind of stuff. So it kind of flies in the face of rate stability, rate continuity, and trying to treat everyone as fairly as possible. So typically you won't see geographic rates, although I'm not going to say that there is no places in the United States where you don't see them, because there are still a few around here and there. Okay.
May I comment about on what you just presented? And it all follows and makes good sense, but in actuality, is what I understand is that happened is you then from this December 17 study presented the CEO with 4 different rate structures, varying demands and energy costs. And he managed to pick the one that penalized heavily the residential class, resulting in an increased cost for residential members by around 50%. And it was a matter of him choosing from the 4 structures that you had offered him. And,
well, let me clarify that, because that's not exactly true. In other words, I think you're confusing 2 different things. In other words, revenue requirement, which how much money are we going to get from the residential class, was chosen independently of the rate design. So in other words, all of the options, the rate options presented to the board for Schedule A would have resulted in the same increase to Schedule A. It's just the rate would have taken a different form.
Hey, Larry, I just want to do a time check real quick to see how many slides we had left as well, because we have about 20 minutes left.
Okay, I think we can get through.
All right,
we need to move.
yeah.
Okay. And you'll see what I'm talking about when we get down here a little bit further. So let's just quickly go through rate design principles. You know, rates should be fair and equitable for all members. Customers should pay the cost they impose on the system. How you do that is you recover fixed costs through fixed charges. You recover variable costs through variable charges. We try to reduce or eliminate subsidies between classes and reduce or eliminate subsidies within classes. Now, getting back to subsidy reduction and the dilemma that you often face is, let's look at Schedule I TOD there that has the negative 9.64 rate of return. To get that class to break even or 0 rate of return would have required a 57.4% increase. So, you know, right off the bat, you know, we're not going to be able to get that class even up to break even because we can't create that kind of rate shock for those people in that class. So you have to live with a balance of rate impact and how much subsidy you can reduce. In other words, it's an art at this point. The science comes into play on the individual charges, but this is where art comes into play, is balancing the increase with subsidy reduction and trying to balance those two considerations to get something that's reasonable. And I just wanted to show you that so you have an idea sometimes of the dilemma that faces board members and staff when they look at, you know, what's going on with the rates and how do we deal with trying to reduce subsidy but not creating rate shock or hardship for members in certain classes. Okay, so let's talk about subsidy inside of a rate. You know, we've talked a lot about subsidy between classes. Let's talk about subsidy inside of a rate. Now, this is not San Luis Valley data, although we could probably do the same calculations for San Luis Valley because we do have interval data. So we could probably construct this for San Luis Valley. But you can, with interval data, you can literally take the cost of service allocation methodologies and you can carry it down to individual members in a rate schedule, and you can calculate rates of return for an individual member. For example, Vince, if I knew where you were in the interval data, I could allocate costs all the way down to you individually and calculate a rate of return for your premise. Okay? So this is a graph. This is actually small commercial. This isn't residential. This is actually small general service, small commercial type customers. And the orange line is the class rate of return, which was around 5%. The individual blue dots are the rates of return of each member inside the class. And this is a rate that's based on a customer charge and a kilowatt hour charge. And with this particular rate, the customer charge was below what the cost of service study said it should be, which meant that the energy charge was higher than the cost of service study said it should be. So you can see there's a huge amount of subsidy going on inside the rate. In other words, it's not a very fair and equitable rate because you've got some members that have rates of return above 150% and some members that have rates of return at a negative 150%. And that's because, just in general, an energy-only rate or a two-part rate can't adapt to load factor and coincidence factor. So it can't capture those things. So it bills everybody just a straight kilowatt hour charge, and it can't tell whether your load factor is better or worse, or your coincidence factor is better or worse than anybody else's. So it creates subsidies. And that's why you see this upward sloping line. In other words, as the load factor increases, which means you're using more energy, those members tend to have higher rates of return. That's why that cluster of dots is upward sloping. And if you don't buy a lot of energy, in other words, if you have a poor load factor, you typically don't cover your costs. So these rates tend to have higher load factor customers subsidizing lower load factor customers. Now, as we correct the customer charge and get it to where it's cost-based, still a two-part rate, kilowatt hour and customer charge, you see it gets a little bit better. It's still not great, but it gets a little bit better. As we move to a demand rate, in other words, a three-part rate, so here we have a demand charge, a customer charge, and a kilowatt hour charge. You see how it flattens everything out. And we've got even better uniformity around the overall rate of return. So it's a more fair and equitable rate than a two-part rate. And that's because a three-part rate does adapt to load factor differences, but it does not adapt still to coincidence factor. So it's still limited in what it can do. As we move to a four-part rate, which means we split the demand charge into a distribution demand and a purchase power demand, the rate now can adapt to load factor and coincidence factor, and we get even better uniformity and dispersion around the overall rate of return. So once again, more fair and equitable than where we started. Now, the shortfall of this rate is we're billing the distribution charge on a monthly demand, which means if your peak in the year, let's say, is 100 kW, but 8 months out of the year, you only use 50, you don't really cover your full cost because your costs are based on 100, but your bill 8 of the months, let's say, is based on 50. So you still get some subsidy because of that. And the solution to that is to implement what's called a ratchet, where you bill on either the current month's demand or the highest demand in the preceding 11 months. So it, in essence, makes it bill on the annual maximum is what it does. If you
Hey,
go
Larry.
if you go that far,
Hey, Larry.
Yes.
I just wanted to let you know, we have a little bit over 10 minutes left, and I wanted
Okay.
to make sure they have any wrap-up questions. So do you want to just go through quickly through the rate design?
Yes. Yes. Thanks, Sharice,
Sure.
for keeping track of it.
Sorry for interrupting, but I have to keep everybody on time.
Right. So you can see in terms of fairness and equity, that's about as good as it gets. That's a sophisticated rate design, and it would involve education to bill it to most classes. But I think that's where you'll see the industry go over the next 20 years with AMI metering having that ability to do that. So let's get down to rate design because we've only got, I think, 3 more slides, maybe 4. So here's what we did in terms of subsidy reduction. So you can see each class's rate of return. What we did is we tried to move it more toward the overall rate of return to eliminate some of the subsidy. So the left-hand column there is where we started. The right-hand column is after the rate change. And the sole purpose here is just to try, like I said, to move the needle in terms of subsidy reduction. We can't get rid of all of it. You know, it didn't get there overnight, and it's not going to go away overnight. So this is the first step in the process of reducing it and trying to move the needle. And in terms of the dollar impact, if you look at the increase decrease column, that is the total revenue change for each class. So rate A, I wish it had rate A on it, but that general service single phase is rate A. We lowered it 2.8% or almost $300,000, $299,865. And you can see the very bottom total, as close as we could get to zero, it had an overall change of revenue of $2,380. So that's as close as we could get to absolute zero revenue neutral rates. Okay. Now rate A, where we started, you had a $29.75 customer charge and a 14-cent energy charge. And what the board settled on was a $35.40 customer charge, or the settlement rate is a $1.03 demand charge and 11.7-cent energy charge. So aside from the reduction of almost $300,000, you can see we moved money out of the kilowatt hour charge up into the customer charge and into the demand charge. So the kilowatt hour charge dropped. We created a dollar demand charge that didn't exist before, and then we added $5 and what is it, 65 cents to the customer charge. And for the average member, and keep in mind this is average, this doesn't mean that some members' bills didn't go up and some members' bills didn't go down, but the average was a decrease of $3.12 per month.
But when we got billed, the demand charge went up to $7.50, not $1.03.
I'm not really following that.
This is showing Vince, the settlement demand rate.
Right, the existing settlement rates is what this is.
Oh, so what you're saying is after we took him to court.
Yes, this is the current existing
Okay.
The settlement
Schedule A
agreement rate.
rate.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and that is much different than the rate that was levied on us in April of 18.
Right. In other words, in that rate, the demand charge was higher, the energy charge was lower.
I follow you. Okay.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
the next slide and this is the last slide. This one shows
Right.
the other rate that was also implemented in October.
Right. So the current rate column was what existed prior to the rate change. So you had, if you're a single phase member, you had a $33.75 customer charge, you had an on-peak energy rate of 15.9 cents and an off-peak energy rate of 7.1. The settlement rate is $39.40 for the customer charge, and it's a 4-part rate. So it mimics this. It doesn't have a ratchet, I don't believe. So this is where we're down to on that rate. So it has a distribution demand charge of 50 cents, a purchase power demand of 80 cents, and then a flat kilowatt hour charge of 9 cents. Now keep in mind, these aren't, and neither is the Schedule A rate. These aren't cost-based at this point. In other words, the cost in the cost of service study, the demand charges would be significantly higher. The energy charge would be significantly lower. In other words, if you go, I can't remember exactly where they were, but the energy charge at cost would probably be 5 cents or less. So this is a gradual approach to introducing this type of rate, is what this settlement rate is. And then there's also an A2 rate where the on-peak, off-peak energy piece is split out. So instead of a flat rate, you've got an on-peak energy of 15.6 cents and an off-peak energy of 6.8 cents. So there's 2 options there in terms of the time of day rate.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left, you all. Thank you, Larry, for doing that. And do you guys have any other questions in the last 5 minutes that we have?
I've got
Or do
one
you wanna-
burning question and then I'll shut up.
No, Vince, you are out of questions. We always have to not let you answer any or ask any more questions. No, you can ask a question. Go ahead.
What was the cost to SLVREC and ultimately to us for this cost study that was done that resulted in the rate changes?
We charge $12,000 for the cost of service study. And then the rate design piece is done on an hourly basis, and it's typically you know, $2,000 or $3,000 for rate design. So the total project was, you know, I don't know exactly what we billed for rate design, but I would say the total project was probably in the, you know, $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 range.
That's a modest charge, much lower and more reasonable than I thought we
Yeah.
were incurring. Of course, the consequence of this was a huge lawyer bill. And we're paying for that also.
Larry,
So thank you, Larry. Thank you very much.
so Larry, as I read that, the change in revenue for settlement for part demand was $46,000 roughly. And then for the A2 time of day, then the most recent one in October, change in revenue was $200,000. Does that assume all customers changed to that rate, or is that the actual count that changed?
Yeah, so how that's calculated is what we try to do, but the settlement rate kind of threw it out the window a little bit. But the idea behind time of use rates is what you try to do is for the average member in the rate, you try to design it so that there's not a lot of risk in going to a time of use rate. So you try to design it so that it is revenue neutral to the standard rate if all customers went on it. And of course, you know, there's always going to be you know, people who aren't typical. So it doesn't necessarily guarantee that, but the point of calculating it that way is what you hope to do is minimize the financial impact of people who want to try it, so that it doesn't impact their bills a lot if they're not able to shift costs and actually save money.
So what I'd like to do now is offer to you all, if you think of more questions that you want to ask, to just do your usual and send them to me via email, because we can get those answered for you. I certainly also appreciate you guys participating today, because I know that having to see me 2 nights in a row is probably not going to be fun for anyone.
Well, I'm proud they stayed awake. It's a boring subject, so they all.
I didn't want to
see you
say
snoring.
anything, but it kind of is. It kind of is. But no, I think it was good to be able to see this though. And I think I have recorded this as well. So if you guys want to hear the recording, we can provide that as well. But if you don't have any other questions, like I said, feel free to email me and we can either have Larry answer them, or we can get the cooperative to answer them, or I'll answer them if I have the answers, but I don't know. But again, I really appreciate you guys doing this the night before our next one. So, okay, Mark, we'll give you a quick question. Is there a reason that the REC didn't do a ratchet rate?
You know, I'm trying to remember, because this has been a while back. Usually we have a conversation with the staff, and I'm not saying for sure that this is what happened, because, you know, this was back in 2018. So this is, you know, you're taxing my memory here a little bit, but typically what happens is when we design 4-part demand rates, we'll have a conversation about, do we do a ratchet or do we not do a ratchet? And the risk of a ratchet is, because you're already making a significant change by going to, you know, a 4-part rate. A lot of times the thought process is, I don't want to throw a ratchet in on top of that. So if we eventually go to a ratchet, let's make that another gradual change that we do sometime down the road. And I suspect that that's the conversation that we had, and that they just didn't want to go that far that fast. But you're taxing my memory a little bit, because there's been a lot of clients between now and then, and it's been a while back.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Excellent information, Larry. Appreciate it.
No problem, no problem. I was glad to do it.
Okay, thanks,
Yeah,
Larry.
Thanks from me too, also, Larry. Very, very well done. Appreciate the time. Appreciate Cherise too.
No
Thank
problem.
you. And
Thank
we're
you.
gonna, Kate had just asked a minute ago about making this available, and Jennifer and I are gonna work on making this available so you can get to the recording if you want to go back and hear it. So I think, so just Kate, on a side note, said she called the REC this week and a woman did the research for her to show her which plan was best for her. So I encourage you to keep doing that as well. And we're incorporating feedback and giving that back to everyone. Jennifer's been great about taking notes too. And so take a look at your reports if you haven't already for tomorrow night, and that's what we'll be talking about then. And in the meantime, let me know if you have other questions. Go ahead and email me tomorrow if you need to, or tonight if you want to stay up that late and talk about Larry's boring stuff. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding, Larry. You did a great job. Thank you. So thanks to all of you, and I will see you tomorrow night.
Thanks
Have
a
a
lot.
great evening.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you.
See you.
Okay.
Thank you, Larry.
You're welcome. Good, glad to do it.
Thank you, Larry. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.